Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Deborah Young and I am the CEO of the RegTech Association. Before we commence today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also offer a warm welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends with us here today, and a warm welcome to all of you. So today, our topic is ESG, or environment, social and governance, and we're going to be talking about the impacts. I've been involved in ESG in some capacity for over the last 15 years in my time working initially with investors and limited partners, private equity and venture capital firms, who all those years ago signed up to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. And here we find ourselves 15 years later, where all parts of our ecosystem are really committed towards the measurement of the impacts along those environmental, social and governance issues. And so we've put on this event today with a very esteemed panel to talk about how the RegTech industry is supporting sustainability and ESG goals. Over the past few years, the conversation around these issues has grown exponentially, and in our 2023 Industry Perspectives report really showed clear demand for regulatory reporting and ESG solutions from regulators in particular. So I'd estimate that this is a sign for RegTech vendors who can answer the call. So what does all of this mean? Well, today we're going to be joined by some subject matter experts, and we're going to have a bit of an overview of the landscape and the trends, the climate standards and disclosures, and what's the real opportunities for RegTech. For this event, we've had 150 registrations from 17 countries, and that includes 71 regulated institutions, 10 government/regulators, 7 investors, and 44 RegTech companies. So I'd really like to thank you very much for being here today. Before we get underway, I just wanted to go through some housekeeping, if that's okay. Today will be recorded. Every registered delegate will receive a link to the recording as well as the PowerPoint presentation. If I could ask everybody to have their cameras and mics off unless you are presenting, thank you. We're going to curate the questions in the chat. Please don't be shy. We have a great moderator today who's going to be encouraging you to put those questions in the chat so that he can direct those questions to our panel. And from time to time, you are going to see some polls come up. And we'd appreciate if you could give us your feedback, not only on the quality of the event, but there's also another poll question there. If you're a RegTech company, we'd like to hear from you on that poll. So I wanted to hand now over to Peter Deans. Peter Deans is the founder of Not Without Risk Consulting. He is also a board director of the RegTech Association. Peter has had a long financial services career, including that of a chief risk officer for a bank, and but more recently has been working probably with organisations along the risk spectrum. ESG is something that he covers as part of his work, and he's also helping a good number of startups and RegTech companies in their early stages, getting them to scale and growth. I'm going to hand over to Peter, who is going to introduce our panel today. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks, Deborah, and great to see the interest that we've got in this topic from all around the world. So fantastic again to the team for getting this session together. I think, as Deborah touched on, ESG and climate change risk has sort of been around for many, many years in one form or another, and the world faces enormous challenges. I think the biggest challenge I have is trying to get this into probably a 50-minute session with some great panelists from Deloitte's Potentia Capital and Evelyn from Green to View. But I just a couple of quick words from me, and then I will actually invite Deloitte's on to kick us off with a bit of a setting the scene presentation. I wasn't being flippant that, as Deborah said, with the bit of the history lesson, ESG, or as it was called, corporate social responsibility several decades ago, has been around for a long time. Climate change, I somewhat tongue-in-cheek say, has been sneaking up on everyone, but whether you're a consumer or a business or a policymaker, climate change is not only not going away, but is becoming, a real and present danger to communities and businesses all around the world. It's producing an industry, or many industries now, in the ESG, sustainability and climate change space. And I think what's really exciting is that, all sectors are really responding to the challenge and the opportunities that arise in this sector. And I think for technology-based businesses, and certainly the RegTech ecosystem, both risks and opportunities abound in this space. With that, I'm not going to use up much more of the time, but I will first of all, I think we might just go around each of the panelists, just a brief introduction to themselves, and then I will get the Deloitte's crew to kick off with their presentation. Let's get the four panelists on screen. I can see them all coming here now. It's a bit like a game show, really, isn't it? I might start off with the Deloitte's people. Linnea Simmons, just a brief introduction of yourself, your role, and I always like to say your interest in the topic.
Hi, Peter, and thank you, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I come from Deloitte. I'm a director within our climate and sustainability team here in Australia, working with clients in Australia and globally as well. By way of background and how I find myself working on this particular topic and area of interest is I spent 20 years in the insurance industry. And you learn an awful lot about risk, social impact, and the environment's impact on businesses, people, and livelihoods through that profession. And it's something that I sort of really focus on in the climate sustainability work we do here at Deloitte, working out what are the strategies that we're going to need to do to manage the risks, realise the opportunities from them, and really build that out with organisations.
Thanks, Linnea. Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So my name is Andrew Kerris. I'm a partner in our analytics department within our audit and assurance practice, so focusing on all things digital and all things data. So my history has been as an accountant and an auditor, but the last few years have been spent saying, how do we use technology to assist in that process? And with the upcoming regulations that are coming through around ESG reporting, we've been looking to say, how does technology play a role in that for sustainability teams, finance teams, and everyone who's impacted?
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. Evelyn, over to you.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Moore. I'm one of the co-founders of Green2View. Green2View is an ESG specialist software company. We have an ESG sustainability platform. We commenced Green2View more than 10 years ago, as Peter said, coming out of corporate social responsibility, but more into the voluntary requirements under the TCFD guidelines for the financial markets. And I've worked in software for over 15 years. Thanks.
Thanks, Evelyn. And Stacey.
Hi, I'm Stacey Kelly. I'm General Counsel and Company Secretary at Potentia Capital, which is a private equity firm solely focused on investments in tech and tech-enabled services. I co-lead our own ESG team at Potentia and collaborate more generally with those in the private capital space as part of the Sydney ESG Leaders Group. I think I've been interested in this topic for decades, really, starting with my science law degree, majoring in economic geography, and sort of since then have been involved both in career and volunteer opportunities in this space.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stacey. Excellent. Thanks, everyone, for the introductions. Linnea and Andrew, I might hand over to you now. And my sole KPI for today is to keep everyone on track. So 15 minutes to get through this, and then we'll throw to the panel session and the Q&A.
Thanks for that, Peter. And my goal also is to do a whistle-stop tour of the climate standards and disclosures and landscape overview that we've got for you today. So I'll kick off and then I'll hand over to Andrew through the presentation. I'll get you to move to the next slide and we'll just look at the content we're covering. So we'll look at the standards at a global context and then in the Australian regulatory landscape. where Joe Longo at ASIC has really sort of framed these as the shift to mandatory reporting related to this is one of the biggest in corporate reporting in a generation. So when you've got the chair of ASIC saying that, you certainly know that we've got some revolutionary things going on. And then we'll look at what the technology landscape is that flows from the scale of that change. So we'll get you to move to the next slide where we're really going to dive into the global context. And on our next slide, we've got the map of just showing what's rapidly evolving across the landscape. And really calling out on this particular slide that just in the last couple of weeks in the US, we've had the SEC climate rule finalised. That's been a long time in development, so that's quite significant for that part of the world. And the other call-outs are the European Union ESRS standards and their scope covering not just climate but sustainability and governance, the full ESG realm. And then emerging across a number of organisations is the need to work out how the ISSB global standards are also going to be impacting as jurisdictions look to adopt those. So that includes the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand's already got TCFD, but a TCFD-based standard that's mandatory. But really it's recognising that the rapidly evolving landscape is being driven by those standards and what they mean for different organisations. So on the next slide, Peter, really wanted to just paint the context of what that global movement means. And Evelyn referenced TCFD earlier, which has been a voluntary standard focused on climate. This slide really just shows that moving from that base of disclosure, the SEC rule and then the ISSB rule and the CSRD European SRS standards really take it to a higher level of granularity, scope and reporting disclosure requirements that are mandated rather than voluntary. And this is covering, in the case of ESRS, sustainability topics as well as climate and environmental matters. And then ISSB at the moment is covering sustainability and climate, but with an agenda to do more topics around biodiversity, human rights, human capital are on the agenda to build that out. And then you've got the focus of these being what's material in an organisation's context for investors and users of this information to know what are the climate and sustainability mandates or commitments that organisations are making. So if we just move to the next slide, this really focuses in on the ISSB. And the reason that's key is because it builds on TCFD, which is a widely utilised standard, but it asks for much greater granularity, quantification and new disclosure items. And we've just summarised on this slide how moving from TCFD in the governance strategy, risk management and metrics and targets pillars, you've got a quantifiable growth in the number of disclosures around climate alone that organisations will need to be providing to the market. So that's really quite key in terms of understanding the seismic shift that organisations will be going through and the interest in knowing more about climate and the commitments that organisations are making. So if we move to the next slide, looking at ISSB more specifically and understanding what the governance, strategy, risk management and metrics and targets pillars actually require really highlights that the standards aren't solely about reporting. They're actually about having a strategy and governance over what are your climate risks and opportunities and the right metrics, targets and investment in realising those opportunities or mitigating the risks that have been identified to a client's or an organisation's resilience and their commitments to their goals when it comes to climate net zero targets over the near term and the longer term. So that's got quite a significant ramification for organisations around whether they're going to secure investment, whether they're going to remain viable as we look at the climate issues the globe's facing, and what they're going to need to report to really make that significant shift that mandatory reporting requires. So if we move forward to the next slide. really wanted to include this particular visual because it shows what the global landscape's going to look like over the emerging time horizons. Now, yes, there's a lot going on this slide, but we've got the indications of jurisdictions that are already signalling adoption of ISSB, with Australia out there in 2024, unless it's deferred looking at that release. But there's only over 30 countries who've either indicated or are moving through the process of adopting ISSB in some form. And then overlaying that for the European countries is CSRD and ESRS, and then the US with the SEC mandated rule as well. So there's no shortage of activity around the reporting timelines and how they'll intersect to impact on organisations who operate on a multinational basis, and really need to think through that, which is one of the complex issues that many organisations are facing in this space at the moment. So just to move forward again to the next slide. And moving into the Australian regulatory landscape, so we'll take the next slide again and talk to that a little bit more specifically. What Australia's done is actually drafted legislation and the accounting standards around doing a climatised version of the ISSB standards. So in Australia, the mandate is around focusing on climate first, with sustainability being a following focus once climate legislation is in place. The shift in Australia is focused on using the ENGA reporting protocol rather than greenhouse gas protocols. And initially that would be ENGA's an existing Australian reporting framework that looks at scope 1 and 2 emissions, with organisations continuing or using the greenhouse gas protocol for their scope 3 is the proposal at the moment, which is under consideration. So that's a key area for organisations to sort of navigate how they're going to integrate those reporting protocols and start being able to capture their scope 3 emissions, particularly as a complex area where technology is going to play a key role. Then you've got scenario of analysis, at least two scenarios, one being the 1.5 degree climate change, so that organisations can really consider their resilience over the near term and long term that I mentioned earlier, and the SASB being removed in Australia. So that's really being replaced with the ANZIC industry-based standard for consideration of what's the relevant sort of metrics and targets and considerations across the standards in Australia. And then Australia's also looking at broader application, so not just private companies, but not-for-profit as well, and how they can be brought in within the scope of the standards at the moment for Australia. So moving to the next slide. This is around Australia's approach to phased implementation, depending on an organisation's number of employees, consolidated gross assets, or their revenue as well, and whether they're reporting already under the ENGA framework or have asset ownership of greater than 5 million. And this really maps out how Australian organisations will start moving towards mandatory reporting over a phased time horizon, with reporting that's incorporated within their annual reporting frameworks in terms of timing and content, subject to assurance, initially of just scope 1 and 2 emissions, but then in the longer term having reasonable assurance of all the climate-related financial disclosures, and that the content and all of the information that sits behind the reporting is maintained for 7 years and available to be considered and explained on that basis. And then also a liability framework, looking at what's the modified approach to acknowledging some of the information in the reporting is very forward-looking. So how can the governing bodies of organisations who are producing the reporting be held liable, but acknowledging that the information is forward-looking and needs to be considered in that light is also a key consideration of how the standards are being adopted within the Australian context for organisations to live up to. I'll just move to the next slide, which is where I think I hand over to Andrew. So I'll do that and hope that that's been a quick 10 minutes of just setting the scene.
Thanks, Linnea. And if we move to the next slide, there's a huge amount of content that Linnea has just been through. And in engaging with CFOs, we survey them twice a year to get a sentiment on their and what's on their pulse. And if we focus on the middle column there, the ESG narrative is shifting, and it's because of the standards and the required reporting under a regulatory framework rather than voluntary reporting. It's being elevated up to board levels. And in a lot of organizations, we're seeing the responsibilities shifting from what used to be a climate or a sustainability team into the CFO and the finance organization. So there's still a lot of uncertainty around that. But at the same time, if you look at the right-hand column, there are opportunities for technology to transform, to shift, and to shape. And so that's what we're seeing from CFOs. There is a challenge with ESG, and there's a broader opportunity with technology. So if we move to the next slide, again, one of the things that we're seeing in speaking with organizations is regulatory requirements and meeting that minimum requirement versus using this as an opportunity to create value and to actually unlock new value streams to support society, but also in selling their products and services. So in order to get that right balance, organizations are thinking through, am I going to shoot for minimum baseline compliance, or am I going to go for value creation, or kind of how do I get there? And important in either scenario are the 5 key pillars at the bottom there around data. So having a strategy, having the people in place and the capabilities in place, making sure that the processes exist, the data is being captured, and that the technology is being set up to either meet the minimum requirements or to create value is really important. And many organizations are trying to answer those questions. How do I get to the finish line as quickly as possible because the reg requirements are coming in, but also have that longer game view? And so if we move to the next slide, we can see that it is a journey. And the minimum level that organizations need to get to is to this stage 2 compliant. Right now, we're seeing most are in the reactive stage, and they're trying to figure out, do I have the data? Am I capturing it? Is it being centrally recorded, and is it reliable? And for a lot of organizations, as they're working through right now, particularly in Europe, where there's a big focus not just on climate, but also on the social aspects, a lot of this data isn't being captured, or if it is being captured, it's in spreadsheets all over the organization, and it isn't structured and it isn't governed very well. So what we're seeing is a big opportunity for organizations to think through their strategy and then think through where do they want to get through. Do they want to be a stage 2 company, which is the bare minimum? Or are they seeking to shift further up that curve and eventually get to a stage 5 company where they're actually embedding ESG requirements into their strategy, into their ongoing reporting, both internal and external, and using it to unlock value rather than just meet those compliance requirements? If we jump to the next slide, which is the final slide before we go to the panel, and I appreciate it's a busy slide, but it does highlight what we're seeing again in the market in terms of there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of digital opportunities that exist. And I'll draw your attention to 3 key things. In the blue box in the bottom left, there's a requirement to kind of get to that minimum compliance level to be capturing data, and in particular GHG, and as Linnea said, using the ENGA framework, but then also considering the GHG protocols, and then also figuring out the carbon accounting modules. I can't stress enough that data capture is absolutely critical, and how that is managed and used throughout the process to have the compliant reporting, but then also think about it from a strategic perspective. And then moving slightly up into the incremental phase, that 4th bullet point there, enable interoperability and dependencies between the various technology systems. The reality is there is lots of information that's going to be needed to make informed decisions about upstream and downstream suppliers and customers and different aspects within the organization. So thinking through data architectures and system architectures to be able to cope with what's needed today, as well as what's likely to come tomorrow, is critical. And I think this presents lots of opportunities for RegTech organizations and for technology companies to come in and address some of these challenges, these problems, but also these opportunities that exist for different organizations as they come up with this mandatory change that is being thrust upon them with a very quick turnaround to being able to comply. So that brings us to the end of the overview. As Linnea said, a whistle-stop tour through the reg landscape and also what we're seeing from a data and tech perspective. But looking forward now to engaging in some panel discussions.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Linnea and Andrew. A lot packed into those slides, but I think particularly in the first section, I think it's important to actually just put some baseline information out there, because I'm sure a lot of the people dialing in have got general understanding of some of the reporting, like TCFD, for example, but I don't think probably not the granularity about, certainly in Australia, about the reporting requirements for the Group 3, which is going to capture quite a lot. Maybe that's a bit of a question I'll ask a bit later on. Who how many companies are actually captured by Group 3? Let's get Stacey and Evelyn on if they'd like to turn their cameras on. I'll give you guys a chance to draw a breath after that whistle stop tour, as you said. Evelyn and Stacey, I mean, there's a lot to take in there, both in terms of just the reporting and regulation, but then I think that second part in Andrew's last 3 slides around opportunities, which we might come to a bit later on, but maybe just Evelyn, I'll start with you. I mean, as you said, you've had a long history in corporate social responsibility, ESG. I mean, what's your sort of perspectives and takeaways from, I guess, where we are today and the Deloitte's material?
I think if I could just sum it up with one very important point, and the adoption of ISSB standards is the very first time that it's been created a comprehensive global environment and a common language for disclosing a company's climate-related financial risk, which is incredibly important for investors in the capital markets. I know we've had a few hiccups with the EU's CSRD and also with the US SEC climate disclosure rule, but regardless of a couple of roadblocks in the adoption, it is moving ahead. So there will be a globally aligned reporting guidelines, regardless of any kind of, I guess, pushback regarding ESG or sustainability, as it's referred to. From my perspective, I think I'd also like to throw in that from an ESG perspective and a reporting push, although it's regulatory drivers that are pushing ISSB, ESG has always been driven by the financial markets and continues to be. And I'll give an example to the audience. With almost half of the world's assets under management, so we're talking about $43 trillion are now linked to net zero emissions goals, and that's under the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which is a mouthful. Achievement of the key criteria of ESG reporting is essential. And domestically in Australia, we're very much, I believe, still in catch-up mode. But with a changing government, we've seen a rebuilding of our reputation on a global stage, particularly with the introduction of the Climate Change Act, Workplace Gender Equality Act, and the reform of the Carbon Credit Unit Scheme, and now the adoption of ISSB reporting standards. So I think the good news is that Australia can step forward, but we have a lot of catch-up to do, and I think it's here to stay. There is no way we're going back.
You're on mute, Peter. Sorry.
Thanks, Evelyn. I think your point's well made, and I think markets have moved well ahead of where Australian policymakers were until recently, and perhaps we're a little bit here in Australia sort of thinking, oh, we'll go our own way, but reality is that the external environment, regulators, and the corporate landscape is pushing this way as well. Really good points. I'll just point out also, if you've got questions of either Deloitte's team from their presentation or as we go along, drop them in the chat and I'll keep an eye as we go along. Stacey, over to you, just your perspectives on, I guess, the state of play at the moment and Deloitte's painting the picture of the landscape.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting, and I mean, it can seem really overwhelming. And so I think that there are opportunities for providers and products that can really distill and digest and assist in that data gathering and reporting obligations. And I think particularly for us at Potentia, the Andrew slide on sort of recognising it as a continuous journey was very apt. We, as part of trying to get our own framework involved. And drafted, we looked at all the various protocols, and I think just in that manner of don't let perfect be the enemy of good, we focused on a number of metrics and to try and just get that data as a baseline to then try and shift the dial in relation to these. And I guess just the the other point that I was thinking about during the presentation, which was highlighted, is that it really is that integrated approach that's required and now touches on all business units. And I think historically it was always seen as a risk and compliance issue, but really it has to be progressed to an opportunity for all aspects of the business. And it shifts that emphasis. For instance, is compliance and reporting going to assist a sales team in getting a large client? And I think that emphasis and priority, in addition to the legal changes, it just makes it be considered as part of a value creation rather than simply risk mitigation.
Yeah, and I think we've already seen it through the membership base where they're getting a lot of the vendor questionnaires around ESG. What is your sustainability strategy? And they go from 70 questions to 700 questions in some instances. And if you've got the data ready and you're in a good rhythm around producing this, you certainly stay in the game in terms of winning contracts and new partnerships. Linnea and Andrew, we have got a question in the chat already, and I wouldn't mind just that question I was asking around, how many do you think are in that group 3 of greater than 100 employees or 50 million revenue or 25 million assets? Maybe we do that one first, and then I'll go to the question around this, when will the sustainability requirements follow the climate change requirements? Do you want to have a stab? Have you guys done the data on what is that population that needs to report in 27, 28?
I haven't got a group 3 statistic, but I have got a number, and it's looking at 23,500 is the total number of filers across the scope at the moment. So that'd be group 1, 2 and 3 is an estimated figure that we've got in as we're looking at some of the material and comparing the reach of the standards. So when you look at CSRD and SEC and the Australian version of ISSB, 23,500 is the total filers number, or estimate. I'll preface it with that.
Well, presumably group 1, it's a bit of a pyramid. Group 1 must be like 1,000 or, a fairly small population base. Andrew, anything you want to add before we go to the question?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that the Group 3 definition is the same as the definition for someone who needs to get audited. So in essence, if an organisation is currently subject to audit requirements under Chapter 2M of the Corps Act, it then will also be required to comply with these requirements. So I think the Australian reach is a little bit further than other countries, but that's, we've got a 5-year roadmap to get there.
Excellent. And maybe, Linnea, just that question, I presume you can see in the chat.
Yes.
How likely do you think it is that sustainability requirements will actually follow the climate change ones within AASB, and over what time horizon?
This is a great question. It sort of asks me to be a bit of a fortune teller. I think there's two thoughts around this. Is if you look at globally the reach of something like the SRS and that it is sustainability, and that ISSB is already framed that they're already working on biodiversity, human rights, human capital, and the relevance of those areas to Australia, I'd say that there is a likelihood that, particularly thinking about social topic areas and the governance areas for, the public sector and a number of organisations who have social implications in their businesses, and the associated climate and social factors being intertwined, that becomes a lead indicator, I think, that ultimately we'll see the scope broadening. I think with the draft that's been done of a climate only at the moment, it's really looking at how the legislation's set up and the consultation occurs for it to be a starting point for then moving to broader sustainability topics across horizons. In terms of time frame, I wouldn't even speculate. I think it's something that reasonably is a massive transition for organisations, and that's been part of the consideration at the moment as to how do you quantify, how do you have strategies in place, and how do you build the skills and requirements, because technology is going to need to play a significant role in conjunction with expertise in the market to respond to this. So that's where the phased approach to Group 1, 2 and 3, and even whether profit or not-for-profit organisations are initially in scope, really just says a lot around how we're tackling climate first and will learn from that experience. But the other comment I would make is we work with a number of organisations where it's not just climate. And if they're part of a multinational network, or they've got a value chain where they're selling into or receiving out of Europe, they're already impacted and are going to need to have a sustainability strategy to be able to position themselves as a provider or into those markets across Europe and globally. But equally with government tenders, RFQs, etc., they're not just contained to climate. They're really looking at Indigenous, gender, and a number of the areas that Evelyn was referencing earlier. So despite the pace of change and not being able to put a time horizon on it, there's certainly movements in the market and an expectation that are going to drive change.
No, you're absolutely right. And the S and the G does get lost a little bit in the ESG mix. No, thanks for that. And Stacey, maybe just finish off on the regulation side, then we can get on to a bit more of the technology aspects. I mean, just with your COSEC and lawyer hat on, I mean, how daunting do you see the task from the regulatory reporting perspective, and any sort of advice or guidance you can give anyone, either if they're dealing with companies or if they're, involved in some of these likely reporting entities?
I think, in particular, I think it's trying to work out what applies to the market that you're in, where you want to go and where your investments will come from. I mean, as a private equity firm, we view ESG through 3 scopes. That we've got investors and investor requirements, often through large institutional and superannuation funds in Australia and overseas. We've got portfolio companies that might need to report or might need these solutions. And then obviously we're always looking at investing our own funds into some of these companies. So I think it's sort of the sheer number of applicable legislation, whether you want to be best practice, and in particular that a lot of tech firms have a global TAM, and so it's not only in one jurisdiction and how you address it. And I think it's constantly changing as well. Obviously there's a huge focus in Australia, as we've heard, in the EU and in the US. I mean, also there are some states in the US that now have sort of this anti-woke legislation sort of that's coming through. So it really just does depend, and it's trying to get a handle on where you want to be operating. And I think as has been mentioned, obviously it's not just climate, it's the modern slavery, it's looking into your supply chains, it's reporting on gender pay gaps, which is all about the social and the governance. And I think apart from sort of specific legislation or reporting requirements, there's also general increased scope of directors' duties and shareholder activism and other requirements to consider some of these issues. So I think it's fairly broad and its reach, and it's sort of just the first step is actually seeing what's applicable to your organisation.
Yeah, and I think Linnea touched on it about developing a sustainability strategy, and I guess to sort of broaden it a little bit to sort of say, well, there are lots of opportunities that are arising out of this tectonic shift in looking at sustainable business practices, obviously addressing the environmental and climate issues as well. But you already see a lot of, again, probably the bigger end of town, the likes of the BHPs and the like, really spending a lot of time explaining what they're doing. And it's not window dressing or greenwashing, but it's actually tangibly, we are doing things in our, mining operations and thinking about recycling water and the like. And I think, again, the disclosures are sort of front run a little bit of the regulatory requirements for some of these larger firms who have seen the opportunity, or at least seen the downside if they don't start to talk more about what they're doing. And again, you can debate with some of these industry sectors whether they should do it more or less, but I think it's a good pointer as well. Maybe we might just turn on to perhaps some of these opportunities. Evelyn, I might just go with you. I mean, just in the near term, if you're thinking about, maybe more pointedly for the RegTech sector, what are the opportunities? Where do you think people should be really focusing their attention in, what are the business opportunities in this next couple of years?
I think in the next couple of years, and just reinforcing what everyone's been saying, the social and governance reporting and accountability is really where we're seeing a huge drive. We work in the SME market, so we're not working with tier 1 clients, but the SME market are being required to report not just on their carbon emissions, etc., or their utilisation of resources, but importantly, they're being asked with regard to all their workplace compliance laws. We're looking at if they're going for government tenders under the Gender Equality Act, the Fair Work Act, and the amendments to the Modern Slavery Act that are coming out. They're being pushed hard to see how they can respond effectively. And so I think that is a huge focus for organisations. And secondly, in the supply chain, which we would refer to say scope 3, but the export markets. And so a lot of companies are exporting to particularly the Asian region, when we consider that Asia is a huge market for us, and China alone makes up in excess of 34% of our export market, and we have 12, I think it is, of the top 15 export markets are in Asia. It's interesting to note where they are moving. A lot with regulatory compliance in Singapore and Hong Kong across their stock exchanges, and same as Japan. But China's a really interesting one, because anyone who's exporting to China will see a real push, because they have now aligned their mandatory reporting on their 3 stock exchanges with the EU's double materiality framework, which means that not only do they have to report on their financial risk associated with environmental, social and governance, but they also have to look at the people and the planet side. So looking at how it's impacting on the environment in which they're working. So for organisations, and I think it was Lumia who mentioned with regard to the EU requirements already for companies operating multinationals, etc. This is a big push for anyone who is in the supply chain business of providing product either directly or indirectly. And for the government tenders, exactly the same. If you don't qualify and adhere to the legislation that's been implemented across the different gender diversity, gender pay gap, etc., you're ineligible to now respond to government tenders. So we're only seeing that as being more and more important for organisations, and how they address that is really where we see an enormous amount of growth over the next few years.
No, that's great insights. And maybe just throw to Linnea and Andrew, is that from what you see in the clients, again, on the opportunities side, do you see the threats and opportunities, I guess, in that small and medium-sized market? And again, thinking a bit about RegTech opportunities, any thoughts there? Linnea, I might start with you.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 lenses that just thinking about this in terms of opportunities. There's clearly going to be a need for specialist skills and technologies. So understanding greenhouse gases, carbon credits, and the technology in those spaces around climate and sustainability topics. But there's also a need to look at the integrated reporting that Andrew called out, and how this is becoming part of financial reporting, and the tools and regulatory tools that now mean that chief risk officers, chief information officers, chief CFOs actually understand and can report climate sustainability in the same way they've had rigour around their financial reporting. So we're seeing a lot of organisations trying to work out, how do you get clear on your data governance, that your integration to know that information's of the same quality and coming from reputable, reliable sources across your value chain and your network. So procurement and those areas of business, I struggle to find an area that's immune from the opportunity, rather than the other way around. But thinking about it through those 2 lenses is perhaps, I think, how I manage it in my own mind.
And you've pointed out a really important point, is it's not just the disclosure, but the audit requirements that come with it. So I think if you look back at some of the sustainability reporting, the last decade or so, maybe this is where the greenwashing thing has come from, is it's fundamentally not audited. I mean, no one has really been checking it, but I think, as Stacey touched on, the regulators are onto it. And I think Deborah highlighted at the beginning that ASIC's looking at it as well. So again, there's going to need to be quite a bit of rigor around the disclosures, not just for the sake of disclosing the right thing, but again from a compliance perspective. Andrew, anything you want to add on the topic? And again, you're a bit closer on the technology side as well. So what gets you excited about the technology opportunities here?
Yes, I think one of the great opportunities is the great shift away from spreadsheets. At the moment, a lot of the data is collated in spreadsheets by whoever it is in the organization. And to that point that you made earlier, Peter, it will be subject to audit. It will be disclosed not so much in a storytelling way that a lot of the current organizations are using it, not as marketing material, but telling the story and putting it forward, versus the compliance angle. And it is subject to audit. It is repeatable. It is measurable. It is comparable against peers. So I think that move away from spreadsheets, and I think there's a big void at the moment in terms of to where. There are technologies that exist, but there isn't a clear path forward in terms of how to get there. And so I think for me, the things that excite me at the moment is, with Gen AI kicking in, there's huge opportunity at this juncture to actually start with a clean slate and say, how do organizations want to structure data collection and measurement and monitoring? And that's a big thing as well. I was having a conversation with a client to say that, typically, for example, water is measured by what goes out. But this client had operations in Russia, and snowmelt goes through their drains. And so they can't then use what's going through the drains as how to measure how much water they're consuming. So there's going to need to be interesting solutions applied to capturing that data in the first place. Once the data is captured, how is it stored, and then how are you using it? And the scenario modeling is one area that's going to be required. And how can we be really smart with scenario modeling and actually build out, great predictive modeling on different scenarios, different opportunities, so that organizations can meet the requirements? Because I think one of the great things about the ISSB standards are it's not just tell us about the risks, but also the opportunities. Whereas historically, it's always been, tell us all the downside, all the things that you have to manage. This is also tell the upside and where you think you can make gains. So I think there's a huge opportunity for those who get their data capture and data storage right, and then lay over that with a great Gen AI strategy. That there's great possibility to infuse this into every aspect of the business. Like Stacey mentioned, it's not just a compliance function that sits off to the side. It'll be infused in all of the operational aspects, not just the back office aspects, to help decision making, to help open up new markets.
Yeah, no, we might come if we have enough time, we might just come back to AI, and we have actually got a question on AI as well. But maybe just around that point off, and I think just Linnea, I think you mentioned it very early on, a little while back, about the CFOs, sort of taking charge and the CROs needing to do more. I mean, I guess the devil's advocate a little bit is I see a lot of organisations, medium, size, large ones, they don't actually have a chief risk officer, they don't have a risk department. And, if they're in a less regulated industry, there's not much to see. And so this task, or the Mount Everest they're going to have to climb, it's probably going to need the chief financial officer to do it, because there's pretty well no one else. And I think to Andrew's point around the data, and this is the Gen AI challenge, is it's a bit of garbage in, garbage out, is like, I think there's a mountain to climb in terms of focus on data integrity, which, is the bedrock of the RegTech sector, but it's fundamentally financial services that have been really driving that for regulatory reasons. So I just do wonder if the task is probably bigger than what people are expecting.
I think there's opportunity in that though too, Peter, and that's usually where I think you could look at how banks and insurance companies are actually looking, what can they build for their client base, because it is a mammoth task. And also, I think thinking about that sector of the market, where what are the tools or the guidance you can have to just start with identifying what's even material to your organisation. And what we see is that you've really got different expertise coming together in a very different way than it formerly did. The sustainability report, or the climate statements, or the marketing team were doing the reporting on climate and sustainability. But this connection now with the financial reporting means that you've got different stakeholders in a room to start answering those questions together. But you're spot on around who actually is going to take the lead within any organisation, realising that it's solving, yes, climate sustainability issues, but also the business's viability, the business's strategy, the market and reputation that you're going to have. And I think to Evelyn's point around what are the opportunities you want to pursue locally or globally is going to be driven by this, as it will be the ticket to play. But there's also a lot of resources and learning and targeted expertise that you can get access to, and emerging examples and guidance. I know the IFRS Foundation are building their hub of knowledge to help organisations transition and work through this. So it's to Stacey's point earlier, I think the common word is it's overwhelming, but there's building blocks that you can start with to make it a little more manageable.
That's great. Just conscious of time, and I do want to come to that AI question, but there's just one come in. Evelyn, a question for you on this same topic. With the SME clients you deal with, who has responsibility for ESG? And Stacey, maybe ask you the same question.
Depends on the size of the SME. If it is a small to medium, and I'm talking about a company that's probably between 20 to 80 mil in revenue turnover would be small, then it's going to be either the founder or the CEO. Above that, we're dealing with usually the CFO or a general manager of risk. So that's around 150 mark.
And Stacey, just in your experience, and maybe
I think
some of the portfolio companies you see as well.
And I think many of our portfolio companies have really small management teams, but I mean, obviously it's a responsibility of the board, but generally the data is collected by either the CFO or otherwise the appointed person is sort of almost a chief people officer, to the extent it relates to more the social and the governance aspects.
Yeah, many hats. Maybe we'll just go to the AI question then. Stacey, I've probably got one more question just on the investment side, if we've got time. Andrew, I think you touched on it. What do you think AI will and can have the biggest impact now, in 1 year and in 5 years? Do you want to have a stab at that one? And then I'll ask for a volunteer amongst the other three if people want to weigh into AI.
Sure. Well, what I will start with is right now, I'll say what we're using it for. And so at the moment, we are using it to help organizations understand their current state reporting against the requirements in the future. So we're actually have built a module where we can ingest all of their public information and then use that to actually do a gap assessment to say how big is the mountain that you need to climb for your current disclosures versus where the requirements need to be. So that's an answer to what we're seeing right now is what we're using it for. In terms of how organizations are going to be using it in a year from now and in 5 years' time, I think that the possibilities are huge. I see a lot, as I mentioned before, in digital twins, which is creating a separate digital company and then being able to run scenario analyses. And that includes things like energy consumption and compute. So how are you actually managing those sorts of things? I think there's going to be a huge opportunity for technology companies to come in and sell these services to large organizations to be able to work through that. And then I think as well, just in terms of streamlining the processes more broadly. So, Gen AI has lots of potential functionalities and uses, but fundamentally trying to come up with new and novel ways of achieving the same outcome. So streamlining the internal reporting. So once the data framework is sitting there, how do you then streamline the management reporting that you're going to be doing, the internal KPI setting and those sorts of things, really trying to drive home on the fact that if you do have a solid data foundation layer, how do you get the machines to do most of the heavy lifting? So it's the analysis and the decisions that are being done by the people rather than the gathering of information.
Yeah. Evelyn or Stacey, do you want to have a bit of a bash at what might get you excited around AI and ESG?
I might have a go first if you don't mind. I'll give a plug to my company, GreenToView. We've already implemented an AI module for data capture and integrity of data. So we worked with an NGA auditor with regard to what they believe would be the requirements. So we see this as an essential in ensuring the integrity of the data that is being reported on by companies. So I think that is an enormous potential in the compliance and also certification space as well.
Stacey, anything
Yeah.
else you want to add?
Oh, not too much to what's already been said, but interestingly, when one of our portfolio companies was speaking about using AI in some of these aspects, it was also about how you use the time that is now no longer used as you're saving efficiency in sort of collating the data. And it's also then as a business, how you then make the most of the productivity gains.
There's definitely a productivity uplift already, I'm sure, for many people. We might draw a close there. We did have one more question, unfortunately, we run out of time. But look, for me, thank you very much. This has been a fantastic exercise. And Andrew, I know you touched on digital twin. I've had a little bit to do with that as well. I think we could do another whole webinar on digital twins, and there's probably a few other little topics. Stacey, we didn't get to talk about from an investor's side where the opportunities are, but we might save that for another day as well. The investor's perspective. Deb, I think I've met my KPI with 4 minutes to go. So over to you to give a bit of a wrap and sign off.
Thanks very much. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. I think you are right. This is not necessarily the end of the journey. It could be just the beginning. And so we could find that we cover this as a topic several times a year because it will continue to evolve. But I think what's really important from our perspective is that we can bring together some subject matter experts to surface the issues and help RegTechs that are out there being able to tap into the right resources and help. But in particular, some of the things that I took away from that, in particular around, having a sustainability strategy, there is going to be some pressure from investors. So if you're looking at capital raising, you will really need to look at ESG and whether you have a sustainability strategy. We already know that there is appetite from regulators around this. And we love to finish on the point of generative AI because in some of the conversations we have, it's kind of everybody's talking about some kind of future state. I mean, generative AI is here, and we've already heard today people are already using it. And if you're, probably on your desktop every day, you're already using it without necessarily already realizing that you're using it. So it's definitely the here and now, not necessarily a future state. So please join me in thanking all of our fantastic speakers for being with us today. And before I sign off, I thank you for the people that are clapping their hands. It's always nice to see. You can see on this slide, we've got some very exciting events coming up, including our Accelerate RegTech Global program. So there is an online component to that, but also a face-to-face version. So if you would like to come along to that, you will be sent a copy of that slide, but all of those good events are actually on our website for you to see. Also, a special notice that we're helping the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK send out some information around an AI tech sprint that they are doing. So if you would like to know more about that, watch out on the deck because there was a link to that information that you can go and explore, particularly if you're a RegTech, because they're really looking for some RegTech companies to come and play in their sandbox. And last but not least, please give us a ranking on how much you liked or did not like our program today. Hopefully it is positive. If you could give us a ranking, that just means that we know where we are hitting our stripes and where we are not. And in the spirit of finishing exactly on time, I will call proceedings to a close and thank you very much and have a good evening or a good day wherever you are. Thank you very much.